Oui, bienvenue, Excellence, invité distingué. We have a wonderful opportunity today, fascinating for each and every one of us. What's next in the Canadian political landscape? A new Liberal leader, a new Prime Minister. How can we understand what's going on? We're going to gain some great insights. These are fascinating times for each of you in your countries, but very much for us here in Canada. And why? Because it was just 3 weeks ago, as we know, that Liberal Party members chose a new leader who, in fact, became new Prime Minister. 1 week ago, a 5-week federal election was called. Combined with what's going on south of the border, there's a little bit of anxiety. There's a little bit of uncertainty for just about all of us, and many things that we do not understand. But what is fascinating for those of us who trust in God, there can be stability and there can be peace. For practicing Christians, we know that this is, well, we're a little over halfway through the Lenten season, which is a time of preparation for Easter. And it's 2 weeks until Passion Week. A fascinating week, which culminated or seemed to culminate with the brutal crucifixion of Jesus Christ by those who at the time were in power, the Roman Empire. And so all of a sudden, the hopes of those who thought that Jesus was King of the Jews were totally dashed. There was huge disappointment and a sense of absolute hopelessness. As we know, that Saturday, many, many years ago, was one of great deep darkness and despair. But then was Sunday. Then came the resurrection of Jesus and his appearance to many as recorded in the gospel narratives. And so it is that reality that I think gives hope and a sense of optimism to those who look beyond the kingdoms of this world to see and know that there is one who is sovereign, who is good, and who is at work. And so we at the Christian Embassy, our hope and desire is to serve each and every one of you, each and every nation, whatever our faith background or not, but to do that through all kinds of offerings, whether it's one-on-one meetings to inspire and encourage you professionally, personally, and spiritually, whether it is through English as second language classes, whether it's through this kind of panel, roundtable, business tour, luncheon, or otherwise. So we're delighted that you could be here for this opportunity. We trust that there will be more as well for you. We can have this time today because of each and every one who's given of their time and energy, but particularly because our very busy panelists, we are delighted to have Lucas Malinowski with us, as well as Mike Donison online this time from BC, as well as Harold Albrecht, Dr. Harold Albrecht, who will moderate, but also will present as someone who served for 14 years as a member of parliament and was in 5 different campaigns. So would you please welcome with me, Dr. Harold Albrecht.
Thank you, Darlene, and thank you to all of you for being here again today. I know many of you were here a couple of weeks back when Lucas and Mike gave us a great presentation. And here we are again with circumstances having changed significantly since our last meeting. And I'm thrilled again to introduce Mike. He's not on screen yet, but he will be later. Mike is a professor at UBC, professor of philosophy, economics, and political science. He has served as the executive director of the Conservative Party of Canada. And he's a great guy to ask a question of if you have a question on political events. And Lucas Malinowski, a public affairs communications professional. He has also had extensive political experience with working with premiers, with cabinet ministers, and many others who have served in elected office. So I'm going to turn the time over to Lucas. He's going to give us a 15-minute presentation. So Lucas, welcome. Thank you again for your time and your expertise sharing.
Thanks, Harold, and thanks, Darlene and Christian Embassy for putting on this event, and to Cardis for hosting us. And nice to see some faces we had at the last presentation we put together for you ahead of the results of the Liberal leadership race. So we thought it would be timely to come back and speak to some of those results. And as we expected, we find ourselves in a federal election. So we'll have Lots to talk about. So, as I'm sure you all know, on March 9th, I believe it is, which feels like a year ago, the Liberal Party of Canada chose its new leader, and overwhelmingly they chose Mark Carney. In the end, we had 4 candidates: Mr. Carney, Chrystia Freeland, who was a cabinet minister in the Trudeau government, as well as Karina Gold, who was also a cabinet minister, and Frank Baylis, who is a former MP from Quebec. There was a 5th candidate when we last met, Ruby Dalla, who was not permitted to stand as a candidate for the leadership, and Chandra Araya, who was an Ottawa area MP, who also was found to not qualify for the leadership. For those of you who were at the last presentation, I had a slide where, I discussed what Liberals typically look for in a leader, and I thought it'd be useful to use that slide again when we consider why the party chose Mark Carney. And really, Liberals typically look for 3 things in a new leader. That's electability, electability, and electability. The Liberal Party has a long history of being a sort of center-left, center-right party in Canada, depending on where the political winds blow. But as an institution, it is interested in building a sort of big tent coalition and ensuring that they continue to govern to the right of the NDP, to the left of the Conservative Party of Canada, and shifting where they need to, when they need to. For this leadership, it was clear to the party that Mr. Trudeau would not be successful in another election, although there was some hesitation to politely ask him to leave. I think the politeness ran out eventually, and we found ourselves in a leadership race. And very quickly, I would say surprisingly quickly, the party agreed that Mr. Carney had the best shot at leading the party to another mandate in 2025. There wasn't so much concern about who is the true Liberal, who best represents the legacy of the current government, who has the most political experience. It's really, quite frankly, who can win. And so some of the other things Liberals were thinking about is what that election we now found ourselves in would look like. Because as you know, Parliament was supposed to come back a week ago on March 24th, and it was certainly my expectation that the Liberal Party wouldn't have Parliament come back. We'd go into an election before that. It's quite clear that the other parties would not support the current government, so it made sense that whoever was going to be chosen as the leader would have to go into election right away, and that's something Liberals were considering. And these are sort of, I think, the 3 things I see for sort of the major parties going into this election. The Liberals looking to maintain the momentum of Mr. Carney. Already the polling has improved significantly for the party, and they're going to be looking at keeping that going into the end of the month, recognizing that he doesn't have a lot of political experience, so there's a lot of vulnerabilities there. I'd say the Conservative Party is grappling with now facing a different election than they expected. They were in the lead for quite some time and expecting to go into this election where the question is going to be, do Canadians want to elect Mr. Trudeau again? He's no longer on the ballot. And the questions about affordability, which I think are still there, but really the question of who's best served to negotiate or deal with the Trump administration is really taken over as the ballot question. And then all the other parties, the NDP, the Bloc Québécois, the Green Party, are really fighting to stay relevant in that election, figuring out what they have to say that Canadians may want to or actually be interested in hearing. Back to the point of Liberals choosing for electability. This is the aggregated polling across Canada as of March 26, and I knew I'd have to update this when we sat down because these numbers are shifting quite quickly. The Liberals were projected to have 185 seats. That's up to 187 now. They need 172 to form a majority government. And this is a significant flip from what we saw before Mr. Trudeau stepped down. So, the Liberals were choosing to elect someone based on electability. I'd say their instincts were probably fairly good. But as we always say in Canada, elections matter. A lot can still change between now and the end of the month. As I said, Mr. Carney doesn't have political experience. This is the first time he's ever put his name on a ballot for anything. He's never run for a school board trustee or a city council or a member of parliament, let alone prime minister of the country. He does have a lot of experienced Liberals around him. It's an interesting mix of advisors who were around during the Trudeau government at the end of the government, some who were around the Trudeau government at the beginning and left for various reasons and have now come back around Mr. Carney. And there are some who haven't been around so much in the past decade, but find Mr. Carney's more centrist brand of liberalism more familiar to them in past iterations of the party. So he does have a good, strong team around him, but I would say that the Conservatives have still a better oiled machine, and Mr. Poilievre is probably, from a pure instinct, one of the strongest political animals Canada has seen in a very long time. So a lot can still happen. And then, of course, there's the Trump factor. We'll see how that plays out in the campaign. So some things I think will decide the results of the general election, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, and Mike and Harold will have some thoughts as well. I think, question one is the Trump question. Who will be seen to best be able to deal with the Trump administration while not being seen as too aligned with the Trump administration? It's a difficult tightrope to walk. Where can you negotiate with him? Will he take your phone call? But you don't want to be too friendly with him and be seen as someone he supports either. So that's an interesting line to walk, I think, for the two major parties. As I mentioned, Mr. Carney's political ability and his instincts, we're already seeing some challenges. There's questions around his abilities in French and how he answers questions in French versus English. And maybe he says things he didn't mean to say, which can create problems. I think for the most part, the individual things on their own over the past week haven't derailed him too much. And I think he's still generally seen as the best equipped to handle the political instability with the Americans. But that over time, if it continues, it's like barnacles on a ship. They add up and they could become a problem. And then the final question is really the political organization of all the parties, because, as a reminder to everyone, we don't elect prime ministers directly. We elect a House of Commons. So it's 338 individual elections across the country. And each party's ability to organize at that local level and get their votes out will really have a significant impact and dictate the outcome of this election. But I would say, from the Liberal perspective, they're certainly feeling a lot better than they were 2 months ago, but still a lot to be decided and concluded. Do we have any questions?
We've had no questions come in yet, at least to my phone. But I have one question that, as Lucas was talking, you showed the percentages that each of the candidates received. And you have Mark Carney at 85.9%, or basically 86% across the country. And what I found interesting, and this has been highlighted in a few news articles that I've read, is that percentage point, 85.9, is fairly consistent across virtually every area of Canada. And there's been some question as to how can that happen? How can that be? How can it be so consistent all across Canada at such a high number? I don't know if you're compared to address that issue or not. I'm not expecting you to have the definitive answer, but you can give us some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I have some speculation. I will say Liberals were also surprised by this result, because Mr. Carney won, I think, every riding in the country. And as you say, like, Karina Gould's a sitting member of parliament. He got something like 87% in her riding. And with Ms. Freeland, something like 85%. I think Frank Baylis actually did the best in his own riding. That's faint praise, because I think he managed to pull something like 15% or 18%, which was very surprising. And I think it goes back to that point that, Liberals were looking at political doom, and they set aside things like, even if you liked and volunteered for your local member of parliament, like Karina Gould could be your member of parliament. And I'm sure she had conversations where people said, Karina, I really like you, but we need to win. And Mark gives us the best chance of winning. So if these MPs couldn't even pull their own ridings, I think it really speaks to just that momentum of everyone very quickly coming to the same conclusion that Mark Carney has the best chance of winning. So everyone needs to get behind Mark Carney and hope for the best.
There's one other question that I'm going to take the privilege of asking. Then if you go to go back one here. So you have Alberta and Saskatchewan with an incredibly high number of people who are supporting the Conservative Party and an incredibly low number supporting the Liberal Party. What are your concerns if those results would stay through an election? and you have Mr. Carney as the prime minister and having such minimal support in the West. Does this pose a risk at all for national unity?
Absolutely. I mean, part of the challenge with this is, these were similar numbers, although the Liberal number in Alberta would be even lower under the Trudeau government. And we know that under the Trudeau government, the relationship between the prairie provinces, specifically Alberta and Saskatchewan and Ottawa, were not at their best. And this is another variable we're going to be looking at on the other side of the election, along with Mr. Trump. I think Mr. Carney will make the case that he's a son of Alberta. He grew up in Edmonton. He was born in the Northwest Territories, so he may have a different perspective. But he's already been saying some of the things to, I think, try and address that potential issue. Streamlining infrastructure development, getting more Canadian energy to Tidewater. Probably not as much as the premiers of those provinces would like, but I'm hopeful that the national unity issue is best addressed if the economy grows and the economies of those provinces are growing and they are getting their products to market. And I think the Trump question has created a new environment in Canada where for a long time we couldn't get anything built. We're seeing already rapid movement potentially on internal trade barriers between provinces, which is something policy thinkers and politicians have been talking about in the country for 30 years with not much movement. Now all of a sudden we can tear those down in 3 months. It's a brave new world. Yeah, but hopefully we don't get into a national unity crisis.
Exactly. I
Because
think
we'd like
that's
to
a
avoid those.
concern for all of us.
Yeah.
Question. Some commentators have said that Mr. Carney is among the most conservative Liberals. Do you agree? And why?
I don't know necessarily that that's because the Liberal Party kind of straddles the center. Who is the most conservative Liberals kind of shifts, right? So if the party is moved to the left like it did under the Trudeau government, I would say, yeah, he probably would be more on the conservative side of the party. But that is swinging back now as the party's looking more at what they need to do to meet the moment. So is he the most conservative? I don't think so, but he's definitely on the right side of the party.
May have misread that. It's among the most conservative.
Among the most conservative. Well, yeah, potentially.
I don't think we want to be definitive on
No,
defining
that's
the
right.
most conservative, but thank you for that response. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I enjoyed very much Lucas's remarks. I have to say, with respect, that he has, with due modesty, has understated the situation. If I can just talk a little bit about how we got here and where we are, I don't think we all realize what an unusual, extraordinary situation we've been in politically, historically. Just so we know where we got where we are, first of all, we had a very rare occasion in Canadian politics where a sitting prime minister actually was forced to retire early against his agenda as a result of a public caucus dispute. Most prime ministers, when they become very unpopular in Canada, normally they keep their caucus in line, but they see the polls and leave office that way. Mr. Mulroney left in those circumstances, as did the former prime minister's father. That was an extraordinary development, very rare in Canadian politics. It happened once, I think, in Mr. Chrétien's case, where Mr. Martin forced him out early. But that, I just think we understand, that's a very unusual situation. As a result of that, of course, we had a prime minister who prorogued Parliament and gave the opportunity, of course, to the Liberal Party to choose a new leader, which they've done. But in addition to that, you have that trifecta, all of a sudden, of a very unpopular prime minister suddenly retiring. And when you take that combination, because there was a lot of public opposition, as we know, to him and his government, you combine that with the opportunity for the Liberal Party to be appearing, to be replenishing itself and doing so successfully, and electing a person who is tailor-made, at least in appearance, and I emphasize appearance, to be someone that can deal with the third trifecta, is this a perceived national existential threat from Mr. Trump and the tariff. And I don't think we should underestimate the effect that Mr. Trump has had on public opinion. It's been absolutely amazing. So if you combine all those things, where are we at? We last spoke, I think it was on February 5th. Since that time, and certainly since January, what are we seeing? There was a poll taken just before Mr. Trudeau announced his retirement, one of the national polls had the Liberal Party at 16% and down to 30 seats. What are we seeing now? We have polls 40 to 45% with seats upwards. In fact, two of the major pollsters today, including Grenier at CBC, now has the Liberals at 193 seats. A complete massive turnaround. Government approval. Abacus indicated that just before Mr. Trudeau's resignation or announcement, the government had a negative 42% point disapproval. It now has, the government of Canada has a 5% plus. Both Mr. Grenier and the 338 Canada Inc., who's the other major poll aggregators, as they call them, say there's nothing been like this in Canadian political history since polling began. So we've had a massive movement in the electorate as a result of all these factors. And I don't think we should underestimate what's happening. Lucas has been modest. He's used words like significant increase in Liberal support and a little bit of support. No, there's been massive switch. I've never seen such a switch in the electorate since this. The other interesting dimension that I want to mention is the age difference. For instance, Abacus did a poll just recently I thought was very interesting. I like Lucas's comment. Amongst the 18 to 29-year-old voting bracket, when asked what was the most important issue facing Canada, only 15% said Trump and 60% said cost of living. However, those over 60, my voting group, reversal. 50% think Trump is a major threat to the country, and only 35% say standard of living. And what's really significant and could be very significant in this election is the 60 over group, they vote overwhelmingly. My age group votes about 80 to 85% turnout. Amongst the younger group, it's more like 45%. My background is obviously conservative, but I see, and from my experience, the makings of a huge, I hope I'm wrong, but a huge Liberal majority. It could be in excess of 200 seats. There's something going on in the electorate. The expression I like to use is the electoral tectonic plates of the country are shifting. And I've never seen a shift like this. I don't think we should underestimate it. As Lucas said, campaigns make a difference. There's still 4 weeks to go. Anything can happen at a campaign, but it's going to be very, very difficult for the Conservatives, in my opinion, I'm being frank about this, to turn this around. It is possible. The other thing that's developed in the electorate too, which is very clever by the Liberals, is they're kind of equating Mr. Poilievre in style with Mr. Trump. And I think you're also seeing, as well as that concern over Trump and seeing Mr. Carney being perceived as the best person to deal with that problem, I think you're seeing the Liberal progressive majority of the country beginning to gel behind the Liberals. And this explains, of course, the collapse of two left-wing parties, the NDP, which I've never seen such a massive collapse in their support so quickly, and also considerable bloc support is dropping in Quebec. And so when you combine all these factors together, we just have a major, in my opinion, political tsunami of huge dimensions, and I don't think we can underestimate it. Now, as Lucas properly said, campaigns, can make a difference. There's still 4 weeks to go. Some of my conservative friends listening to me now will be disappointed what I'm saying, but I see myself as more as an objective observer than a partisan. And so I just think we're under incredible political developments. Fascinating. I've never seen anything so interesting in a long time, but I think we just need to not understate the situation we're in. And I guess as a conservative, all I can do is pray in a secular sense, and then pray in the end, of course, as a Christian, that this is all beyond our control anyway.
Thank you very much, Mike, for those thoughts. I'm just going to take a few minutes now to talk about what elections are like from the local perspective. I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination. I have gone through 5 federal elections, and just a little bit about how elections work at the local level. Both Mike and Lucas have referred to the fact that we don't elect our prime minister directly. It's done at the local level through our EDAs, our electoral district associations. So local electoral district associations, each year after the 10-year census, the Electoral Boundaries Commission makes changes to the boundaries of the electoral districts to try to maintain a degree of equality in the number of people in each district. Now, many times today you've heard 338. In 2015, there were 338 electoral districts. In 2025, there are 343. So even though we still talk about the 338 website, it's technically 345 EDAs. So next slide. So each nationally registered political party can have a local board of directors in their electoral district. So you have a conservative, a liberal, an NDP, a Green, or a Bloc, or other party affiliations. As a member of any party nationally, you are automatically a member of the local EDA for your party that you belong to. So members of the local EDA, Electoral District Association, are eligible for election to the board of directors for the party that they represent. The nomination contests are held in each local EDA to determine who will be the candidate to carry the banner for their respective party. And only members of the party, not necessarily from the local district, can run as nominees for the candidates. So you could be from British Columbia and you could run as a candidate in Ontario as long as you're a member of the national party. The candidate is chosen by the EDA members. Now that is a normal way of doing it. There are obviously cases where the national party has stepped in and appointed the candidate, much to the chagrin of the local members of the EDA. So the candidate then surrounds himself or herself with a campaign team manager, a chief financial officer, volunteer coordinators, and so on. And the volunteers go door to door and they install signs and they do fundraising. So door knocking is still the preferred method of convincing members to vote for you. Obviously, local advertising and social media are important, but that face-to-face contact with an actual voter is incredibly important. So most parties still rely heavily on teams of local volunteers to go door to door. Incumbency as a local member of parliament who has been in power in your riding, it can be a huge advantage comes election time, but it can also be a huge disadvantage. And I saw this just in the last couple of months where the local members of parliament who were representing the Liberal Party suddenly were unelectable. And 3 weeks later, with the choice of a new prime minister, new leader, they are now electable again. In fact, we saw one candidate who pulled out of the riding, out of his race, and came back in when he realized the fortunes had changed, all due to the leader of the party. Do you want to say something? Go ahead.
I just think they had enough time with their families, Harold, and were happy to come back into politics.
They got sick of their families, wanted to spend more time away. Yeah, okay. We'll take that under advisement. Incumbency, each elected member of parliament occupies one seat in the House of Commons. The party with the most seats forms government. And as Lucas has indicated, 172 seats are needed for a majority government. This is a little bit about campaign financing. This is so much different than the US and probably different from many of your countries as well. The maximum expenditure per party, per riding or electoral district is between $90,000 and $152,000. And this varies depending on the demographics of the riding, geographics of the riding. So a very large rural riding will have a larger expense cap because they have more travel to do and things like that. And donations can only be accepted from Canadian citizens or permanent residents. And the maximum donation per donor is $1,750. And that's for all EDAs. So if you're in an area like I am from Kitchener-Waterloo, we have 5 ridings in my area. I might decide I want to support 5 different candidates, but the total of my contribution to those 5 is $1,750. I can't give each riding $1,750. So I got to decide how I want that split up. In addition to making contributions to the local riding association, you can give a donation to the national party. Again, the maximum, this slide says $1,725. It's the best one I can find. It's an old slide. The maximum per person donation is $1,750 to the local riding and $1,750 to the national party. So you can make the 2 contributions separately. Now, there's an obvious tax advantage when you make the $400 donation, because at $400, you get a 75% tax credit. That percentage drops the more you give, but you can give up to 1,750 and get roughly 1,000 or 1,650 deduction. Oh, and I should have mentioned in the last one that no corporate donations are allowed and no union donations. So it's thought that the Conservative Party benefits mostly from corporate donations. I don't think that's actually true. I think the Liberal Party benefits from them too if they were allowed. But no corporate donations are allowed and no union donations are allowed. Personal tax credits are also available though. So on the last slide, election financing, accurate, detailed financial records are important. After the election, each EDA or each campaign receives a 60% refund from Elections Canada for expenses incurred, and they must have had at least 10% of the vote. So you can't have a fringe party that gets 2% of the vote and has a big expense getting their money back from Elections Canada. And after the election, the National Party receives a 50% refund from Elections Canada for expenses incurred, and they have to have, again, they're the qualifiers, 2% of the national vote or 5% of the votes in EDAs where the party endorsed candidates. So the Bloc doesn't have candidates in every riding. Their qualifications are different. So that's just a little bit about the local scene. Now I'm going to go to the questions that have come in. So how does the upcoming election and the results of it shape Canada's new strategy towards Africa? That's a tough question to answer from our panel members, but Mike, do you want to take a crack at that one?
Well, I'm not aware of any discernible policy differences amongst the major parties in terms of Canada's relationship with the African continent. I guess the only thing, and we'll see, it's more stylistic whether it's real, Mr. Carney has been making noises of moving away from our concentration on our relationship with the United States, and that's understandable, towards Europe. And it's quite possible that his government, if he's reelected, might shift that also, combined with that some African policy. But I'm saying I'm not very well informed on this subject, but I'm not aware of any fundamental differences amongst any of the political parties on dealing with our African nations.
Yeah, I think Mike's covered that well. I mean, what will be interesting is, Canada goes through a cycle every, 10, 15 years of trying to decouple its dependency on the US. Things get a bit too precarious, and there's always discussions of, well, does Canada turn more to trade with Asia, or does it turn more towards trade with Europe or Africa and other parts of the world? We have that conversation again now in the context of this new administration and this election. And I think this may be another one of those things that we've heard over and over again, but Canada's never really acted on, and maybe finally really acting on, but that's yet to be seen. But I think to Mike's point, there isn't a broad policy disagreements, but I think whoever wins the election will be looking at where are there opportunities to strengthen ties around the world that don't run to Washington.
Okay, thanks, both of you. Will there be public debates among the candidates? If yes, how will it influence the voters, especially those who are undecided? Lucas, take a crack at that one.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what the dates of the debates are. There are 16th, 17th. Yeah, I think the French is the first on the 16th, and then the English is on the 17th. Don't quote me.
Where's the French?
There is a French. Yes. Okay. So this is my point. So in Canada, we have now, for a few elections, a media consortium. So sort of the major media companies come together and agree on organized sort of official debates. Because in the past, we've had a lot of media, channels and outlets all wanting to organize their own debates with their own partnerships. And it became a whole mess of, well, this debate, only 3 of the main candidates are there, but not the 4th. Does the Green Party get a seat? All these things. And it just sucked up a lot of air. So I think the 2015 election was the first time they had the consortia, where essentially the political parties said, you figure it out, however many debates there are going to be, we all agree we'll be there, and then we can pick and choose the other ones. So there's an official French language debate, and there's an official English language debate. And those will be towards the end of the election, and it is a fast campaign. There was the question of the TVA debate, which some would frame as not necessarily a French language debate, but really a Quebec debate. And there was some question on whether Mr. Carney would participate in that or not. And now they've said not. There was also questions of parties being told they'd have to pay to participate. I think $70,000 each to
Right. And the
participate in that debate.
Conservatives have agreed to pay for the fees of that.
Yes, generously. So yes, there will be debates. I think the English language debate probably won't be quite as important as the French language debate. I think there's still a lot of questions about Mr. Carney's proficiency en français, and typically the French language debates are proportionally more closely watched by Francophone Canadians than the English debates are by the rest of the country. So I think that'll really be, if something's going to shift the polls, it would be that, because the province of Quebec has always been very important to the Liberal Party's path to government, and will continue to be so.
Oh, I think in recent years, the televised leaders debates have become the single most important or single event in election campaigns. It's the one time where vast numbers of Canadians actually tune in and pay some attention. You're absolutely right. The French speaking debate tends to be more higher attention to that than the English. So yes, this is critical. And in light of the picture I drew earlier, from the Conservative or even any of the opposition parties' point of view, that debate will be absolutely critical. It'll certainly be critical for Mr. Poilievre, and I think for Mr. Blanchet as well. In fact, if I could make a prediction, one of the most interesting things we watch will be the French debate, and the way, not Mr. Poilievre, but the way Mr. Blanchet, I think, is going to take a political pickaxe, if he can, to Mr. Carney. The Bloc are dropping rapidly in Quebec, and Mr. Blanchet sees the Liberal resurgence there as a real threat. So I think you're right. I think the French debate will be the most interesting, and also the issue of Mr. Carney's ability to participate fully in that debate. I just think the Blanchet-Carney confrontation, I anticipate, will be really interesting to watch.
Okay, thank you. And I would like to say as well that at the local level, the debates are important as well. So you have many of your ridings, different groups in the riding organizing local debates. And it's not so much that people change their loyalty because of the debate, but it cements the voters' position that I will definitely support or I will definitely not support. There are exceptions to that, but I think at the national level, it's certainly accurate that it has a large impact. What will happen if Mr. Carney loses in his riding, but the Liberals still win the most number of seats? Will he assume the position of Prime Minister?
Well, he does. He's Prime Minister now. It's not a question of assuming office. No problem. If the Liberals win the election, this has happened in Canadian political history before. It happened in British Columbia with a premier in recent years. A Liberal backbencher will resign, and there'll be an immediate by-election. And Mr. Carney, I'm sure, will secure election that way. So the fact that Prime Minister doesn't win his own seat it's very embarrassing, and it's politically awkward, but it doesn't raise any constitutional issues at all, as long as he seeks election and a by-election fairly quickly.
Mr. Poilievre's rally numbers say something different than the polls. How do we read that objectively? So we've seen Mr. Poilievre at rallies across Canada with numbers of 3, 4, 5, 5,500 people, and the polls are saying something completely different. How do you read that? Lucas?
Objectively?
Objectively.
So we can't read it objectively, I will say, but it's an important narrative construct for the Conservatives in the election, because they are facing these polls, these questions of, how did this turn around where you were on path for a majority government, and now it looks like the Liberals are going to be reelected again. So showing that momentum and showing, what you're seeing in the news and what you're seeing in the polls isn't what we're feeling on the ground. That'll be important for the Conservatives. It is a reflection, I think, of the party's organizational abilities too, because getting, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people to show up to an event, usually on a day's notice, because you don't want to advertise 2 weeks out that you're going to be having the leader in the riding. So the other parties can't mess with it. Shows a lot of organizational strength. But I think that on the flip side of that, it's not really driving necessarily a message of the day, which is important in election campaigns of, leader X is at this factory today. So the there's a saying we have in campaigns from a visual and from a tour perspective is that people listen with their eyes, right? So it's, you may have the news on or in the doctor's office or something. You're not actually listening to it, but you can glance at it and you can see and you know what that campaign or that leader is about, what their priorities are. If they're in a facility, they're, you know, talking about jobs or trade, or they're, you know, at a construction site, that means they're talking about housing, and those are things that people care about. If you see a rally, you don't know what the message is, so you're not driving the message of the day. And I will also say that in 2011, Michael Ignatieff had excellent rallies with a lot of turnout that everyone was talking about how he was getting record numbers, better than Chrétien in some of those ridings. And well, Harold, you and Mike know how that election ended. Mr. Ignatieff did indeed have great rallies, and I don't think he won his riding.
Very well for me.
It didn't win, but I don't think he won his riding to the previous point.
I have to agree basically with everything Lucas said, but it does show the underlying organizational strength of the Conservatives. And there is a high level of enthusiasm level. I would say it's higher amongst conservative activists, perhaps, than liberal activists right now. But the problem the Conservatives have is that there's just this underlying movement in the electorate that isn't particularly going to be influenced by news stories about a particular political leader having a huge rally. These rallies are important and they're useful. I think Conservatives would like to think that there's an underlying surprise going to come out of this election, and that's always possible. But I think Lucas is basically correct. These are important for organizational morale and for organization, but in terms of impact on the electorate, I'm not sure these rallies have that much effect.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for those very objective responses. This question, and this was a tough one. Who potentially can be the foreign and energy ministers in the future Carney or Poilievre government? This is a lot of speculation, but I don't know if you want to take a chance at that, either of you. Lucas, you want to go ahead?
So I always love these questions because I know where people are coming from with these questions, and I don't begrudge you asking them. Okay, the first challenge is we don't know what the cabinet's going to look like. We don't know, with so much volatility, who's going to win their seats. The prime minister might not have to win his seat, but typically you'll want your cabinet ministers to have a seat in the House of Commons. And, you know, right now we have Minister Joly as foreign affairs minister, who, you know, the prime minister had the opportunity to move her out of that role when he created his own cabinet after assuming the prime ministership. He decided not to, and it wasn't the case for some other portfolios. So I think that bodes well for Minister Joly. It'll depend on how the campaign goes in Quebec too, because part of her advantage in the party is that she's seen as a strong organizer in Quebec. But I think if you have a not so strong showing in Quebec, that might change the calculus. But I don't want to speculate because I think there's just too much volatility. There's too many unknown variables of who's going to, you know, win. And there's going to be the question of, do you want someone in that role whose job it is to really engage with everyone but the Americans and give that role to, you know, the engaging with the Americans role to someone else? Do you kind of put that in a broader umbrella so that foreign affairs minister does engage with the Americans as well? Is there a duo that works well to have in those positions? There's going to be a lot of policy and personality considerations that are hard to predict at the moment. But I'm sure Mike can tell you who's going to be the conservative energy minister and the foreign affairs minister.
Go for it, Mike.
Well, just on the office of foreign minister, and your audience will be interested in this, the foreign minister in the British model very much depends on who the prime minister is. Many prime ministers de facto become virtually their own foreign minister. And so in some governments, the foreign minister isn't that powerful or significant. In others, it's the reverse. I'm not taking away, it's the one of the senior offices of state, of course. I wouldn't have any idea on the Liberal side. The Conservative side, no obvious candidate. There was, of course, some interesting chit-chat about a couple of months ago, speculation, I think it's been denied, that if Mr. Poilievre formed a government, particularly if it was a minority government, he would ask the former Prime Minister, Mr. Harper, if he would be prepared to act as foreign minister. There was some talk about that, but the difficulty is that Mr. Harper isn't running for Parliament, and if he was to stay on as foreign minister, constitutionally, he'd have to be appointed to the Senate in order to carry on. I don't think Mr. Harper, in light of his experience, and I worked with him on this file, would be very much interested in getting an appointment to the Senate. Anyway, it was an interesting speculation. I don't think it would happen. I think it would be interesting. I think Mr. Harper could be a very powerful, significant foreign minister in any government, but I don't think that's in the cards. Other than that, no name particularly comes to me. Harold, you may have some names as to who on the Conservative benches would be a logical candidate for foreign minister.
I'll pass on that. Thanks, Mike. This question is back on a different topic. It actually relates to Lucas's presentation, and it relates to the map with the different polling numbers on it. I don't know if we can go back to that. Why don't we see any data from the Northern Territories in terms of the results or the polling data from the Northern?
I mean, quite frankly, because it's really difficult and expensive to poll in the territories. You don't have, I mean, they're projected as liberal red, but people are so spread out. It's very difficult to get significant enough sample sizes for pollsters, and it's just really, really expensive to poll up in the territories. So unfortunately, we kind of don't have as strong numbers or data as we do in, say, Central
You
Canada.
have to remember that the territories, I'm not sure if I can say this for all of them, but I think most of them have less residents in them than most of the ridings in most of the rest of the country. So it's a very small number. Doesn't mean they're insignificant, but I can see your point about it being difficult.
Yeah, sorry, you make a very good point, Harold. Like, each of those territories is one riding, right? So that's why you're not seeing the bars necessarily. It's just if it's red, then that one seat that makes up the Yukon is projected Liberal red.
And with this map still up there, this questioner says, it seems that Ontario is key in this election. Do you care to elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, Ontario's key in every election. It has the most ridings. And, to Harold's earlier point about Alberta and Saskatchewan still holding strong and conservative, like, that is a base of support for the Conservatives. The Atlantic provinces have been a base of support for the Liberals for a good chunk of time, I would say. The Liberals are currently in government because of Quebec and Ontario. For the last Conservative government in 2011, when they had their majority, it is because they won Ontario. Less so Quebec, but they performed very strongly in BC. So those are sort of the pieces that move as Ontario and as Quebec goes. Typically is how the election goes. We just have the most population there, and the parties typically have a lot more organization there.
This next question is a difficult one for our panelists to deal with, and I don't think we can deal with it conclusively. We're not government officials or government representatives. The question is, as the theme of today's discussion is, quote, what's next in the Canadian political landscape, we would like to know, what are the priorities in Canada's foreign and international trade policy? Regardless of which government is in power, we expect a commitment to globalization, a balance between trade diversification and international industrial policy, and a focus on the Indo-Pacific. I don't know if you want to take a chance on crack at any of that. Mike, do you want to tackle that?
Well, I don't have any particular expertise. There's been a lot of rhetoric in this election, and Lucas made reference to it. Whether Canada is, other than rhetorically, going to pivot itself away from the United States, which is the bigger overall kind of issue. There's good talk on that, but in reality, we're on the continent with our American cousins. And I think there's been more talk than there's going to be reality. Difficult to say. I don't know what those objectives are. Obviously, one thing that all parties agree on is, in light of what's been happening from the United States, there will be an attempt, a genuine attempt, whoever's government, to do two things, two important policy things. One is breakdown of interprovincial trade barriers. All parties are committed to that. And an attempt to diversify the Canadian economy, to be less dependent on the United States. We're learning that lesson. But that takes a long lead time. That's going to be a long time to achieve. So I don't see any big differences between the two parties in terms of long-term foreign policy objectives.
I broadly agree with Mike. I think there will be a renewed openness to have those conversations where there may be opportunities for, mutual benefit or increased trade or energy security. Certainly, I'm hopeful that we'll get better results in this round than perhaps we've had in previous rounds of this sentiment. But yeah, definitely the ears and doors of the government will probably be fairly open, assuming we're not completely consumed with trade war crisis with the Americans that just sucks up all the bandwidth in the public service and at the political level, which it may very well do for the first bit.
Harold, if I could just make one addition, trying not to be partisan, I was a little surprised, though, to hear the Prime Minister of the country and a person of Mr. Carney's background to seriously consider that Canada become an autonomous economy from the United States. I don't really think he really believes that. But given the rhetoric we're in right now, that's a useful political thing for him to say. But that's just not a realistic position long-term for any political prime minister to take it. And neither Mr. Carney or Mr. Poilievre would take that seriously, I don't think.
Okay, thanks for taking a crack at that. I know that was a difficult one to try to get to address from our perspective as non-members of the party, in terms of not representatives of the party, and the fact that the election is still underway. Question: there was a massive turnaround in polling from the end of last year. The parties might adjust and change their strategies. Do you see any possibilities of another turnaround? And which are the main factors of the possible shifting? I think we've sort of addressed that already, that in politics, things can change very quickly, but what would be the main factors in a turnaround if there was one?
I'll make one comment and then I'll maybe pass to you. I think the big question is going to be the NDP, quite frankly, because historically, if the NDP is weak and not pulling off that left of center vote from the Liberals, it's very difficult for the Conservatives to win government, certainly a majority government. And if they were to win a minority government, they may even have a challenge in holding the confidence of the House at some point. I think the real question is going to be if the NDP can come back, they will start to eat away a bit of the ground that the Liberal numbers are under, because I think the numbers are fairly soft, given that they've built up so quickly, and that'll be a critical question if we're going to see another shift again. Mike, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with that. The NDP could be very critical here either way. I think from the Conservatives' point of view, two things. There's always a possibility of some major scandal, or some event that can trip up Mr. Carney and the Liberals. That doesn't look to be evident. Although I must admit, and for this audience, there is a controversy brewing. It's the elephant in the room, but there is a Liberal member of Parliament who suggested that a Conservative candidate should be arrested by the Chinese government. And I think Mr. Carney's going to have a little difficulty with that, particularly in the Chinese community in Canada. He's backing his candidate. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised in the next few days that we see that candidate withdrawing. But, I don't think that's that serious an issue for the Liberals. It may reduce their support a little bit. Other than that, no, I think the only thing that maybe could break through Mr. Poilievre is if he can somehow almost outdo Mr. Carney as Captain Canada. And then secondly, to say to Canadians, I agree with Mr. Carney, we have a crisis, but the crisis, I'm talking about how he would speak in a partisan manner, but the crisis is because we've had 10 years of Liberal government, he will call it misgovernment, that's weakened us vis-a-vis the Americans, and whether that can punch through or not. I would try it, but I'm not so sure that will punch through either. So other than those considerations, the trajectory seems to be we seem to know where we're going.
So I'm going to take this opportunity to thank you again, all of you, for being here. And I don't know about your reaction to the comments today and what I would consider some of the chaos that we feel, at least at a heart level, that we need divine intervention. We need God's wisdom to do the right thing. And I'm not saying what that is. Each of us need to decide that. But we need to at least appeal to divine intervention to help us make the right call. And in that regard, I'm going to encourage us, if you're comfortable, to join me as we pray the Lord's Prayer and ask for his guidance and his direction. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen. I want to remind you again that as the Christian Embassy and people of the Christian faith, we do pray for your countries. We pray for your leadership. We know that many of your countries are dealing with issues that are as complex or far more complex than ours. We're not here to give you advice as to how to do it, but we are praying for wisdom for your leaders and for you as ambassadors of your country, diplomats, that you are doing an incredible job of representing God here on earth. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob.
Thank you, Harold, and thank you, Lucas and Mike, for sharing your expertise and taking the time to join us today, and especially the insight that you have that will help our guests. I'm Robert Montgomery with the Christian Embassy, and I also want to thank you for your participation. We wouldn't be holding this event if it wasn't for you. And so we thank you that you've come, that you've paid attention, that you've listened, and you submitted those questions. Those are excellent questions. So thanks you again for your time and your participation. Have a good day.